everyone, and welcome to this extraordinary meeting of the Council. Before we commence this meeting, I would like to ask everyone to stand and join me in a minute's silence to pay tribute to Sir David Amess MP, who died so tragically on Friday serving his constituency. And if I could just make the note that for the duration of the meeting, we can all remain seated. So, may I first of all remind you of some domestic arrangements. The toilets are situated outside the meeting room opposite the stairs. Cold water is also available in the breakout area outside the meeting room. If the fire alarm should sound, please leave the leave the meeting room by the following fire exit signs and meet on the Ipswich Town Football Club training pitch. Do not re-enter the building until you are told it is safe to do so. Please switch off all mobile phones or turn them to silent. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, you will be deemed by the Council to have consented to being filmed. By entering this meeting, you are also consenting to being filmed by the Council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and/or training purposes. The Council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and the press are not lawfully excluded. And before I move on to the agenda, I'd like to welcome the usual cohort of officers and just to note that Kathy Nixon is standing in place of Arthur Shanovia, and Jan Robinson is standing in place of our monitoring officer, Emily Yule, who is not well, and we wish her a speedy recovery. And finally, I'd like to welcome Nadim Murtaja, who is our new Assistant Director of Communities and Wellbeing, and I believe this is his first council meeting. Welcome. Can I move to agenda now, please? So, apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. I've received apologies for absence from Councillors Haddingham, Councillor Humphreys and Councillor Phillips. Are there any more, please?
Okay. So to item number 2, declaration of interest by councillors. Are there any declarations of interest? No? Okay. Then we will move on to item 3, which is motions on notice. So we have 2 motions on notice this evening, and we're going to move to the first one from Councillor Pratt, and I would like to call on Councillor Pratt to move his motion, and Councillor Pratt, you have 5 minutes to do so.
Thank you very much, Chair, and it's a pleasure to be introducing this motion again. Starry skies inspire awe and wonder. They are a magical sight that bring stargazers and astronomers into the dark locations in our countryside to seek their connection with the cosmos. Light pollution however, prevents us from observing the night sky. It is the result of artificial lighting at night, particularly the lighting that shines or scatters upwards into the sky, producing what is known as sky glow over our towns. Sky glow reduces our ability to see celestial objects that would otherwise easily be seen in the contrasting backdrop of darkness. In some places, artificial lighting essentially turns night into day. Street lighting is no longer only a feature of urban landscapes. With new development and changes in the way we use the countryside, our villages and open country are becoming more brightly lit. Climate change, alongside other environmental and economic concerns, have led to the replacement of conventional lighting, such as high-pressure sodium lamps, with LEDs that are more energy efficient. In addition to producing an intensely bright light, nearly all LEDs emit higher levels of light within the blue region of the light spectrum than their traditional counterparts. Increased light intensity and the shift in spectral composition towards blue light has impacted wildlife, particularly bats, and nocturnal insect population. It can also cause harm to human health and well-being too. Lighting can improve the feeling of safety for drivers and pedestrians, but there are also negative human impacts to consider. Studies suggest that direct exposure to light at night can have serious health implications. It can particularly affect our body's hormones that are responsible for maintaining sleep patterns. There is also evidence which presents a direct link to the development of known cancers, including thyroid cancer. Light entering private households can also be seen as a public nuisance. We understand that biodiversity is in peril. Some estimates predict that 1 million species, or 40% of all insects, will become extinct over the next few decades. Peer-reviewed studies demonstrate how artificial light at night has contributed significantly to insect declines. This is because illumination not only causes disorientation in insects, but affects their natural biological rhythms of that control foraging, migration and reproduction that are normally synchronized with daily, monthly or yearly light cycles. This has catastrophic implications for insect populations. Studies have also shown that artificial lighting at night are extremely disturbing to bats because bats avoid light and change their foraging path and delay their emergence from their roosts, missing the peak time of insect abundances when they should be hunting. Taken together, we must acknowledge the impact the lighting has had on human health and the environment. In our July 2019 meeting, Mid-Suffolk District Council acknowledged the accelerating rate of species extinction by declaring a biodiversity emergency. We pledged to bring forward proposals and take actions to protect and enhance wildlife in the district. To achieve this goal, we cannot ignore the need to mitigate insect declines in relation to artificial lighting as well. Conveniently, LEDs can be engineered to emit lower levels of blue light using colour filters. In particular, we could look into using true amber or phosphor-converted amber LEDs. Brightness can also be reduced remotely and progressively dimmed. Lamps can also be timer and sensor controlled, which means that they come on for shorter periods or only when needed. And shields or baffles can be fitted to reduce sky glow and prevent light from entering households. Other councils are already taking action to reduce the impacts of lighting, especially in wildlife-sensitive areas. For example, Worcestershire County Council installed bat-friendly lighting along an A road nearby a local nature reserve. The street lights are designed using colour filters, especially to emit light that does not affect the natural senses and rhythms of bats, yet which provides enough illumination for residents, helping to make the roads and pavements safer while being highly energy efficient. Okay. Today, I urge councillors to acknowledge the detrimental impact of artificial illumination at night on human health and nocturnal wildlife. Our council can take action to ensure lighting schemes on all new developments meet the best environmental standards through appropriate recommendations and requirements in our biodiversity SPD. Where practical, we can apply tighter controls on outdoor lighting in our own buildings, housing stock and public realm. We must also work with our partners at County Council and Highway Division and private landowners and companies to change the way they use outdoor lighting at night. I'm just going to wrap it up. Through campaigning, we can also encourage the public to reduce their impact. By doing so, we show that we are a council that is adaptable in the face of emerging issues and an ever-changing world. I invite you to support this motion and, as far as I know, become the second council in Suffolk to commit to reducing light pollution. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Fleming?
I'm happy to second the motion. Thank you. Would you like me to speak now or later?
You can speak now if you wish, or you can reserve your right to speak.
I'll speak now then. Thank you.
Please do.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to second this motion, which is about the control of light pollution, as my colleague across the floor has said. The purpose of this motion is to draw attention to the largely unintended effects of artificial light, particularly given that we have made such firm commitments to protecting and enhancing biodiversity. It is also to suggest some ways for putting into place reasonable controls on light pollution. Recent news reports have highlighted the harmful effects of artificial light on wildlife, and not just bats, but as my colleague has said, insects, amphibians, birds, mammals, plants, and of course us. Some of you may have heard Lord Debon's recent Suffolk radio interview, where he advocates reducing artificial light in villages, or actually not having any, with greater reliance on torches. He does concede that towns need lighting for security. He went on to say, which I think is important, the pressures to urbanize the countryside are largely antagonistic to dealing with climate change. Now, this motion is really about rural areas. It is not about removing necessary street lighting or circumventing existing safety standards. So how do we go about doing this? Two tools are suggested as a start. First, as has been mentioned, our biodiversity planning document, SPD, to increase protection for wildlife. We are also preparing a design code to reflect the new NPPF's mandate to value beauty, tranquility, and the natural world. The process of developing these documents will give us ample opportunity to consult further with others, such as the County Council, wildlife organisations, and community safety groups, and to unravel some of the technical aspects so that the resulting documents have clear and practical application. I'm aware that the County Council, which is implementing a large-scale LED lighting replacement programme in the county, can bring in methods such as filters or shrouds or dimmable lighting, which will further mitigate the effects of particularly the white-blue colour range on living creatures. These approaches and any added costs would be considered within the SPD and design code process. Also, I would like to see a much more critical approach to applications for illuminated advertising, thank you, which also contribute much, arguably unnecessary, light pollution and nuisance. Community safety would naturally be taken into account in measures to reduce light pollution. There are studies, however, that indicate that in rural areas, lack of street lighting may not reduce crime, and I believe that balance is achievable between the wide benefits of natural dark skies and the human desire for safety and assurance. In summary, I believe that greater weight should be placed on local sensitivities, both human and otherwise, and it is timely to review this entire subject and add reasonable protections against light pollution through the means available to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. We're now going to move to debate. Councillors will only be allowed to speak once and for 3 minutes, and this will be timed. So who would like to kick off? Councillor Guthrie.
Thank you very much indeed. I too support Lord Deben in avoiding the urbanisation of our rural communities, and he, like I, will be horrified at the new, dare I call them, Belisha beacons in Otley. Has anyone heard of Otley, and does anybody know what a Belisha beacon is? But it's a flashing light, and so I support what the motion is trying to do, whilst a Belisha beacon in Ockley might be useful to them, I'm sure the insects don't think so. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm more than happy to support this motion, but there are just a couple of points I would like to mention. We need to have a framework to decide when and where and put on and not put on. How do you define rural? And I'm not trying to put barriers in the way, but you can, I think we all know of areas which are in mid-Suffolk which are classified as rural but do have extensive street lighting. So there needs to be a framework and an explanation to local people why you may or may not put them on and off. And I absolutely understand this, better use of scarce natural resources like pollution, biodiversity. But in order to make sure the confidence of local people is maintained, particularly those who get some reassurance from a security, community safety point of view, that street lighting is essential. I happen to live in an area, certainly outside where I am, where there are no street lights, but just round the corner from me is a development of 5 houses where they have got a couple of street lights. I never quite understood why they put them there. That was some time ago. So all I would say is, please can we have a framework, explain the logic, why we're doing it, in order to make sure that we do get the public on board. I think that's really, really important when we look at development, so we don't get knee-jerk reactions and a huge variation in where we apply this. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. I certainly will be supporting this motion, and I would just like to, I certainly support Lord Deben's comments about removing lighting in rural areas. I actually grew up in a village just over the border in Essex where we had no street lights, and I was shocked when I started driving in town as to how light it actually was, and that was way back, 30 odd years ago. I think that we certainly need, I agree with Councillor Passmore about making sure we get the residents on board, because I think there is a vast misconception about how lighting actually reducing crime. I think it's just a public perception. Several studies have occurred both here in the UK and overseas have shown that actually dark neighbourhoods do actually reduce crime because local residents will notice somebody walking about with a torch, whereas if it's all lit, I think there have been, I can't cite any, but there have certainly been studies to show that having lights on all night does not reduce crime. In actual fact, it may even increase the amount of crime. So yes, we do need some public awareness about that. No artificial lights in villages. I'm happy with that. In a rural area, as well as the biodiversity, I mean, in a lot of our rural areas, we have, depots and industrial premises, and they do seem to be having an awful lot of light, which is causing a lot of light pollution. So I will certainly be supporting this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I really, mine is actually a question, but we're not. Okay. So, under the Crime and Disorder Act, Section 17, the Council has a statutory responsibility to consider safety and implications in any decisions it undertakes. In essence, this must include implementing and mitigating any circumstances where there is reasonable cause and concern in relation to community safety. With regards to safety and street lighting, whatever decision is made to change the type of lighting for new or replacement artificial lighting, whether in the form of street lighting, commercial or residential lighting, consideration must be given to areas that may have the potential to commit crimes. For example, public lanes, alleys, areas with a lot of wooded foliage cover. I'm saying this basically because of the health and safety of women and girls, and to a lesser extent to men, who in areas like Stowmarket could suffer. Thank you.
Councillor Matheson, your turn.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just a couple of points. This refers to street lighting, and while there are a lot of streets that are adopted by the county council, many new developments now include quite a lot of private driveways, and I think that we need to look through our planning department to ensure that the right kind of lights, if necessary, are put onto private driveways rather than just, you know, whatever's cheapest or something. So we need to just look a little carefully in the light of this motion in that place in particular. I think perhaps the supplementary planning document will go there. And the other point, which might help Councillor Passmore or Councillor Brewster or others maybe, is that I represent the village of One House, as some of you know. And about 40 years ago, when the main estate was being designed and built there, the villagers of the day that were already there said, well, we don't want street lights, we don't want street lights. And there was actually a little referendum held, and the result of that was that they did not want street lights. And I think somebody must have decided, are you sure? Because it was held twice, and twice they voted that no, they didn't want. And it's interesting that the current application for 20, I think it is, houses on the edge of the village, and already I'm getting emails saying we don't want street lighting on this new bit, and that's quite interesting, and that is the express view of that part of the public. So I think the answer there partly is about the logic and the framework and all the rest of it, is to actually ask people. Thank you.
So, Councillor Wellham?
Thank you, Chair. I can remember once upon a time when I was a young engineer, I was so proud of my first road scheme, which included a roundabout with the best quality street lighting that you could imagine. But then I had a phone call from one of the residents nearby who was a breeder of canaries. And he said that because of the lights, his birds didn't know when to mate. And it was a serious complaint and a claim against the county council. So if canaries don't know when to mate, presumably there's lots of other birds that don't know when to mate. But more seriously, high standards of street lighting give very, very bright light. We know that, that's why they're put there. But they also give very, very dark shadows. It's the contrast between the very bright brightness and the very dark darkness, which is a problem. And it helps people who want to misbehave to hide up. So there is research which shows that very often, by having either a very low level of street lighting or switching it off completely, that does not lead to an increase in crime. And my last point is, would it not be illogical to insist on biodiversity improvements on our new developments and not insist on lighting which would not reduce biodiversity? And I'll be supporting the motion.
Councillor Geek?
Thank you, Chair. Just to add some chapter and verse to the great things that have been said by everybody, a 2015 study that was published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health found that streetlights don't prevent accidents or crime, but of course they do cost a lot of money. Lighting, it's been found, may make you feel safer, but Cambridgeshire did some research prior to some reduction in their street lighting, which has shown that it's only in very specific places where there was already a crime hotspot that was made worse by poor lighting. Only then may specific improvements prove beneficial. And of course, all this is very short term. A reduction in crime is a short-term and localised thing, even if it does happen, and you can see from the research that it's unlikely to happen. We'll definitely not be safer if our lights are contributing to the biodiversity crisis, because ultimately we can live without lights, but we can't live without pollinators. So I will be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm going to sort of major on one element which I think that we really can achieve a difference as a council, and that's commercial development, advertising, signage, etc. I do feel sometimes as an urban member that we see a lot of applications for advertising signage within the town centre which are truly awfully bright and don't actually need to be because the town centre is already well lit. But I would hope that we as an authority would show the way to others in the development of Gateway 14, our planned development there, where we're planning to develop a huge acreage, and I think we need to really take seriously the lighting aspect of that, whilst accepting that some businesses will operate 24 hours a day and need lighting for not only security but also operational purposes. I would hope that all of our street lighting and infrastructure there meets the very latest standard, and I think if we pass this motion today, that's something that we should certainly ensure.
Are there any other councillors that wish to speak? Councillor Field?
I was just going to point out that this is not just about turning lights off, it's also about changing the nature of the LEDs we're using. And looking at the graph in front of me here now, if you switch down from the sort of 6,500 degrees Kelvin colour temperature LEDs that are frequently used for street lighting, down to the 2,700 that you tend to use at home and you call warm white usually, you get about a 50% increase in the amount of light in the main area of the visual spectrum and a 4-to-1 reduction in the blue light. So overall reducing light intensity I think is valuable. Clearly turning lights off when you don't need them is extremely valuable. But equally well, a simple move, which is just shifting the colour temperature down, also contributes substantially, reducing the hazard to insects and not impacting on visibility of humans. So I'll certainly be supporting this, you know, for all those reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Field. Right, I don't see anyone else looking to speak, so I'll ask Councillor Pratt if he wishes to add anything further.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I think, you know, taking on board all the comments, it's been a really interesting discussion. I think as Councillor Brewster and has sort of mentioned, perhaps there is a need for a framework to define, you know, what is rural and so on. You know, where would be appropriate to turn the lights off. Yeah, and there has also been expressed the need to get people on board, really, and I really believe that that's important. We need to, as Councillor Matheson has said, ask people whether they want street lighting if it is going in to a planning application, for example. As there seems to be evidence that residents sometimes have expressed that they don't really want it. And I think, you know, we just need to sort of follow the evidence as it emerges, really, in terms of, you know, whether we really need the street lighting in the first place. Does it reduce crime? This might be very context specific depending on the environment, of course. But yeah, so yeah, I'll just wrap it up by saying that, and thank you very much.
I will now ask the Corporate Manager Governance and Civic Office to conduct the electronic vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillors, to consider the motion on notice received from Councillor Pratt, that item is now showing blue. Please can you place your votes? Thank you. We'll need to take your vote verbally. Yeah, 4. 4, okay. And you, Councillor Norton? 4. Okay. Chair, we have 1 vote against and 29 for.
So that is carried. Thank you all very much indeed. We'll move on to item 3B. This is to consider the motion on notice received from Councillor Mellon. Councillor Mellon, would you like to move your motion, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And really glad to see the cross-party agreement on that previous motion, and I hope we can get something similar on this one. The government's election bill is passing through its various stages in the Houses of Parliament and is currently at the committee stage. And this bill introduces a requirement to show photo identification at the polling station in order to vote. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a good thing. Of course, nobody wants to encourage voter fraud. We should be stamping down on this sort of thing. And surely nobody could disagree with proving who you are. But it's when you start to look at this proposal in detail, when you scratch the surface, that problems come to light. Now, we have a long and I would say very noble tradition in this country of resisting the compulsion to carry an identity card around with us. I see I'm holding one here, but various governments have tried to bring them in to the general populace and have failed. So if there was a mandatory requirement for photo ID at an election, what would we use? Well, there are 2 main documents that have a verified photograph on them, and that's your driving licence and your passport, which is fine. And the government has indicated that certain other documents will also be acceptable, disabled blue badge holders, various concessionary passes and the like. But what about the rest who don't currently carry one of those things? And the thinking is that the local authorities would have to issue some kind of legitimate photo ID card, a voting pass or similar thing. And this would be to everyone who needed one, maybe, or maybe just to those who applied. You can start to see when you look at this that immediately this becomes problematic. There will be a cost to it, and that cost will either be to the voter or to this council, as well as an enormous bureaucratic burden that this authority will have to bear. We are the authority that organises and delivers all forms of elections. The other point, of course, is that the people who don't have a passport or a driving licence tend to be those who don't travel abroad or own a car, and these potentially are the poorest sector of our population. So if, in order to vote, we require people to fill in a form or go to a web page or go to an office to get their identity verified, we are just putting an extra hurdle in the way of them expressing their democratic rights. And the truth is, we don't need anything else to discourage people from voting. It's very disappointing, but levels of voter engagement are pretty low, especially for local elections. My final point is this: what's the size of the problem? How much voter fraud do we have in this country? Well, the answer is very, very little. And having checked with our monitoring officer, the number of cases in Mid-Suffolk is 0. None. No reports, no allegations, no charges, no convictions. So I think that this council should express our opinion to the Secretary of State and write in opposition to this measure. I do need to amend the proposal slightly. I've been informed that a letter should more properly be written by the chairman rather than the leader of the council, so that's a small amendment to the proposal. But to sum up, voter ID is an answer in search of a question. It's a very expensive and bureaucratic sledgehammer to crack a non-existent nut. So I encourage members to support this motion. Let's communicate our concern to the Secretary of State, and hopefully he will think again. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mellon. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Scarf.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm very pleased to second the motion and the slight amendment that Councillor Mellon has proposed. According to the House of Commons Library, probably the most controversial measure in the Elections Bill 2021 to 2022 is voter ID. The government argues this will improve the integrity of elections and prevent someone's vote being stolen, otherwise known as personation. It proposes a broad range of photo ID will be allowed, including a free voter card available to those without any other form of ID. I would suggest that even having to apply for this free voter card may discourage electors from exercising their democratic right to vote. As of August 2020, one conviction and one caution had been secured for personation offences at elections in the whole of 2019, hardly overwhelming proof of a problem. Even the Electoral Commission's 2019 evaluation of the voter ID pilots that were carried out across the country found that some groups of people may find it harder than others to show voter ID. Currently, it's estimated that over 2 million people do not have an acceptable form of ID. And indeed, the chair of the Parliament's Human Rights Committee said, "The government must prove that the need for people to get a voter ID does not act as a deterrent to voting. In particular, they must demonstrate an understanding, so far lacking, of the impact of these measures on marginalised groups and show how they plan to ensure access to the ballot box for all." Furthermore, the committee said, "The impact of the proposals may fall disproportionately on some groups with protected characteristics under human rights law. Older people and disabled people are less likely to have voter ID, and some groups, such as Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, may be hesitant to apply for the voter card." I'll leave you with a question. What happens if a voter goes to vote and forgets their ID? Currently, you don't need to take your polling card to go and vote. You just say who you are and they check who you are on the electoral roll and issue you with a ballot paper. If they go to vote under the new system and have forgotten their ID, will they go home and then return, or will they just give up and not vote? So I will be supporting the motion.
Right. So I think we're now ready to move to the debate. Councillors will be allowed 3 minutes as usual, and this will be timed. Who would like to go first? Councillor Hicks.
Thank you. I'm very happy to go first. If we remember back to 2019, the Conservatives were elected with, I think, a record majority. And in the manifesto was the Elections Bill, which is an ambitious, timely set of plans to actually ensure elections are transparent, that elections are fair, and elections are accountable. So a successful small-scale trial was worked on, and that worked extremely well, and that was to stop impersonation and voter fraud, and actually to give improved confidence to the election system. That's what this is about, improved confidence. The bill will ban party campaigners from handling postal votes, and the Cabinet Office has said to put a stop to postal vote harvesting and make it an offence for a person to attempt to find out or reveal who an absent voter has chosen to vote for. So, of course, anyone who doesn't have one of the broad range of documents that's been mentioned actually can get a voter card through a very simple process from their local authority. I don't think that's problematic. I think that's pretty straightforward. So I think actually at the heart of this is about maintaining public confidence in the elections process, and actually I think that's what this does. So I don't think it needs a first glance or a second glance. I think you need to go back to 2019 election when this was in the manifesto and actually was supported nationwide by a record result. So I certainly will not be supporting a manifesto that I think is a retrograde step by taking the stand that the opposition is taking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll be supporting this motion, irrespective of whose manifesto the alternative may have been in. And Councillor Hicks took half of my speech. The only problem we have in public confidence in elections is not the way the ballot boxes operate and the people that work at them and the way that system works. It's the potential to harvest postal votes. That's where we have a very small issue in this country that we need to resolve. So, to crack that, one of the ideas was to have an ID card. I don't quite see how that works. Does the postman then demand to see your ID card before he hands you the envelope with your name on? Do you have to then send a copy of your ID card along with your postal vote? So actually, it's not a well thought through strategy to tackle something that we recognise that more and more people see the convenience of postal voting, and there is an inherent danger, potential danger within postal votes, because who is to know who's signed that and sent that back? Because there's no physical check of the person as there is at the polling booth. There's been, I have to say, at the polling booth I've been going to for a lot of years now, it's been the same mother and daughter there each time, and I tell you, there's been no skullduggery going on there, I can tell you, because they virtually know everyone in the village that they've served, because they were both born there. So, frankly, I think a local solution, i.e. the human being involved in it that's accountable, is by far the best solution. An ID card, by whichever means, I think is a retrograde step. And of course, what it would end up with, of course, is the thin end of a wedge. What we will end up seeing, of course, is a slightly slippery government might put in the fact that, well, actually what you need to have is an up-to-date one. Yours is out of date, which I've noticed my ID for Mid-Suffolk is, because that picture's 6 years old. I look far younger. I'm very sorry. And to get them now, no, you can't get them from Needham Market. It's all been moved to Peterborough. So if you wouldn't mind just going there to get your ID card, you just look how it happens. Look what happens in America, where marginalised voters have to turn up at a particular time in a particular place, 50 to 100 miles away, to exercise their democratic right. We do not need to take any step in that direction in this country. I will certainly be supporting the motion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Guthrie.
Thank you very much indeed. I was a joint signatory on a bank account that's recently closed. I know the tellers, I go in regularly to see them, and I just wanted the account moved to a different section. And I went into Stowmarket today and they welcomed me and said, "How do you do? Thank you very much." And I said, "Well, why hasn't this happened?" They said, "Well, we don't know where you live." I said, "Well, you do know where I live." "Ah, but you didn't present us with a face and an address of where you live." And they know me from old, so I had to drive all the way back home again, pick up a document, and I actually went into Ipswich today with a document with my face and an address on. And it was security, and I don't have a problem with that. So I will not be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Eburn.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to make a few points, if I may. Firstly, 4% of the population don't have any recognisable ID. So that's 4% of people who will have to get something sorted out if this goes through. And who will be sorting that out? The local authority. That's people here. Secondly, 87% of people, this is from Electoral Commission research, feel that voting is safe from fraud. And that is a very, very high figure, as I'm sure you'll all agree. Thirdly, in this country, we have very well-run elections. Now, who runs the elections? Well, there's a few members of staff here that have been involved in running our very well-run elections in Mid-Suffolk. And I think that's a fact that, you know, we should be very, very proud of, and nothing needs to change on that basis. But finally, and importantly, we are the local authority that administers elections. Now, who is going to be paying for a system to provide everybody who hasn't got voter ID with the correct voter ID? Who's going to be helping them out? Who's going to be manning the phones when somebody phones up to say, "Oh, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't have a passport. I don't drive. What do I need to do? Where do I get help? What forms do I fill in?" Who's going to process those forms? Who's going to pay for the staff to process those forms? Where are those staff going to come from? It's all going to land at the door of the local authority, which is Mid-Suffolk. So, you know, just from an absolute local perspective, I think this is be a retrograde step. There's lots of things in the elections bill that I'm sure we'll go through. This is one aspect of it that needs to be changed. And I'd really commend you all to vote for this motion, and I will be. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Morley.
Thank you, Chair. I feel a bit conflicted on this one, actually, because as a matter of general principle, I totally believe in ID. I get really frustrated going to different places and being told you want this piece of ID, or no, you can't have that bit, you want this bit. Even to go and pick up a parcel from Parcel Force at my local post office, I have to take my passport and a bill with me. Having a single ID, for me, is the obvious way to solve all these random bits of paper that we have to carry around with us. And so, personally, if I ruled the world, I'd have everybody microchipped. But clearly that's a different motion. So I do feel a bit, I worry about the ability of our staff manning polling stations to insist that somebody can't vote without ID, or to ensure that somebody without ID cannot vote. But given, as Councillor Eburn has just said, there's only 4% of our residents who don't have an ID, that doesn't seem a very sledgehammer to crack a nut type thing. So I guess I'm coming down on the side of I don't support this. I think ID is a good thing, and the only people it's going to disenfranchise are those who seek to subvert our democratic system. So I'm afraid I won't be supporting this.
Councillor Mansell?
Thank you, Chair. I've listened to both sides of the argument on this particular motion, and I'm a little bit intrigued because we hear that the biggest problem with our electoral system is postal vote fraud, and yet this forcing people to take ID to vote in person is surely going to mean more people are going to be using a postal voting system because they haven't got their ID card, or they can't be bothered to apply for one. I wish I was in Councillor Guthrie's lucky position to have forgotten my ID or didn't take the ID when she went to the bank in Stowmarket, to be able to jump in a car with a driving licence with no doubt a photograph that is her ID, go back home, sort it all out, and take another trip into Ipswich. Now, all of that costs money, and you're actually disenfranchising those people who don't have a driving licence, who are perhaps in minority groups, who haven't got the ID. And I'm sorry, yeah, for a bank account, maybe I'd make the effort, and okay, I'd forgotten the ID or I hadn't got the right ID one day, I would make the effort to go in again with my ID another day. But voting happens on one day. I've taken the trouble to go to the polling station and I haven't got my ID, and a lot of people will not go back home and get their ID and come back again. So we're going to have less people voting in our elections, which is not what we want. And I think because of the hassle of getting an ID card, more people are going to say, well, you don't need an ID card to do a postal vote, I'll do a postal vote. And yet, so this solution of having ID cards is not going to help us in the biggest problem with the fraud in elections, which is postal voting. And I completely understand Councillor Morley's position about wouldn't it be wonderful if we just had a single ID card. That's not what we're talking about. It will be yet another ID card. And okay, I've got a passport, I don't have a driving licence, I'm not lucky enough to be eligible to have a driving licence. When my passport expires, I'm not likely to be travelling abroad, I probably won't have renew my passport, and then I'll have to apply for an ID card. So maybe I'm one of the 4%, but I cannot see that a solution, or the problem that we have with our electoral system at the moment is going to be solved by having an ID card. So I will be supporting this motion.
Councillor Turner? Oh, sorry, Councillor Otten, I beg your pardon.
The motion as a matter of principle. I believe this is, quite frankly, the thin edge of the wedge, which could lead, I believe, to national identity cards, something which certainly the Liberal Democrats have campaigned against many years ago, when there was suggestion that the country would bring in ID cards. I also think it's a real shame that as a result of maybe in a much more urban situation, there have been a few instances where the local authority has had to investigate where ID fraud or similar has taken place. But I do not believe that this is a time that we should be taking on a system which completely discriminates against a significant part of the population. And I certainly will be supporting this motion. Thank you.
Councillor Carter?
Get right button eventually. There we go. Well, I will be supporting this despite having my own conflicts, sharing Councillor Morley's. I would be in favour of if they had microchips as well, especially if it was government funded, free to a consumer, and we just be able to show you microchip to go and freedom of movement. But that's unfortunately not the case. This actually came up in a disability meeting quite recently. It regards members of learning disability who do not have forms of ID and find it either too complicated or would be put off to apply. This also came up in a meeting regards the Windrush scandal, how there's the proportion of voters who are less likely to apply for ID out of fear and actually of reprisal, of actually being asked to leave the country, which you could argue a point both ways in this, but I'm all in favour of democracy. I'm all in favour of people being able to go out and have a vote. I'm in favour of people having more of a voice and feeling empowered to vote and not feeling more marginalised and less likely to do so. And we are finding an increase of people who are applying for postal voting, part of it due to the COVID situation, not wanting to go out of the house. This doesn't solve postal voting fraud. This doesn't prevent it being collected. So we're likely to have an increase of people going for postal voting. We won't have any solution about their votes being harvested. We're increasing yet another loop to jump through. So where is the benefit to us? We're causing more hassle and we're not getting any benefit from it. So I'm certainly in favour of this motion, and more solutions would be looked at in favour.
Thank you. I think I will be supporting this motion. I sometimes wonder, in a world where Google can ask me or tell me which particular cafe I was in the middle of Malta 4 years ago, whether I'm being a bit sensitive to people knowing who I am and where I am. But nevertheless, I guess I was always told that one of the things that separated England, the UK, from many countries in Europe was that we don't have ID cards. Policemen do not have the right to demand they know who you are and what you're doing whenever they tumble across you in the street. And that this is a bit of a move in that general direction. A direction that perhaps wouldn't be too worrying at the moment, but there's always the risk of less benign governments in the future. You know, currently, whatever we might think about the particular incumbents at the moment, they're certainly not people of evil intent, intending to control us the way perhaps we've been seeing on TV in that programme Ridley Road that's common at the moment. You know, they're not a British Nazi party, and we all hope that we'll never move in that direction. But I personally think we have to be very careful about putting in this form as ID as a principle. it also, as many speakers have said, impacts, in the case of elections, particularly on people who are disadvantaged who don't have current IDs. So it's dissuading that portion of the population from voting, persuading them they're more detached, whereas I think Councillor Hicks implied that what we want to do is increase confidence, increase the numbers of people who believe in the democratic system. So I think, you know, taking all those things in combination, particularly also with the evidence from 2019 elections, where there were, was it 8 people who were cautioned by the police or prosecuted. Only one of those was actually for impersonation. Several were for falsifying ballot papers. One was for attempting to steal a ballot box because the person wasn't being allowed to vote. So something that this certainly would not solve. I think taking all those things together, my view is that this is a really bad idea. We should support the motion. We should not move towards formal IDs in this way in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Warboys?
In support of the motion, I think the notion of producing voter ID is very much a solution, a very expensive solution, in search of a problem. In 2019, there were 34 allegations of voter fraud. This was 58 million votes cast without any allegations. The questions have arisen about postal ballots, which is a separate issue. And again, having voter IDs will not necessarily produce a solution. In Europe, ID cards are mandatory. Everybody has one. They get them at an early age. They are free or a very low cost. With an ID card, you can travel throughout Europe, access social services, and they allow freedom of movement. But in the UK, we do not have mandatory ID cards. Passports are expensive. This is a bit out of date, but in the 2011 census, 9.5 million people do not have a passport. 9 million people do not have a driving license. 1.3 million do not have a bank account. So they fell at that early stage of having to provide ID or going through the rigmarole. Northern Ireland has a free electoral ID card, but as everyone is well aware, Northern Ireland has got a history of a necessity of ensuring voter IDs. Public opinion. Polled by the Electoral Commission, 87% said voting is safe from fraud and abuse. I do believe, this is my feeling, that flagging up the necessity for voter ID is actually gaslighting our electoral system. I think there are threats to our democratic system, but it's not the necessity for voter ID. I think we do need to look at the way political parties are funded, how political parties spend their funds, how political parties misinform the electorate, the impact of social media on the electoral system, the manipulation of social media by Conservative parties. So, I do not think the necessity for voter ID is actually a threat to our electoral system. It's already been mentioned that 4% of the population do not have any recognisable form of ID. I believe forcing people to have voter ID will actually disenfranchise a significant proportion of our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Geek.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to back up what Councillor Warboys says and address really Councillor Hicks's views about public confidence in the electoral system. The Electoral Commission research that Councillor Warboys referred to shows that public confidence in the running of elections is as high as they have ever found in all their years of research. And in fact, in the last year, up until 2021, there has been a large drop in the public's perception of electoral fraud as a problem in the UK. Now, the Electoral Commission point out that because election fraud almost never happens, most people have no direct experience of it. And they suggest that it might be stories in the media that have a notable effect on perceptions. So perhaps Councillor Hicks might think about what he's reading and whether it's backed up by research. But as Councillor Warboys says, there continues to be, say the Electoral Commission, a negative trend in the public's perception of the transparency of party and campaigner finance. And that's really the problem of confidence. Where the money comes from to fund political parties and individual politicians. Now, house builders gave nearly £1 million to the Conservatives in just the first quarter of this year. So you do have to follow the money, cui bono. I don't think compulsory ID cards will help this. And in common with many others on this side of the chamber, I really don't like the idea of compulsory identification papers. I don't like the idea that we could be stopped and asked for our ID anywhere. I must just be much more of a libertarian than those on the other side of the chamber. So I will be voting for the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I don't believe we should ever live in a state where officials and bureaucrats routinely demand, show me your papers, as we go about our daily lives. But voting is a privilege. It's a process we should cherish and strengthen, not weaken and dilute by allowing any potential for abuse. And those of us who've attended election counts will be aware of how meticulous is the process of verifying the ballot and the care and attention that our council staff take during the whole process through to the declaration of the electoral result. Now, putting aside the issue about postal voting, and that's something I'd be happy debating in this chamber at another time, to me the only weakness in the whole system as I've observed it is that anyone can turn up at a voting station, be handed a ballot paper, as those staffing the voting station must accept who the person in front of them claims to be without any proof being requested. Now, I personally would have no problem whatsoever with the requirement to show my own ID when I go to vote, and I'd feel more comfortable with the integrity of the voting process nationwide if all others had to do otherwise. And so for that reason, I can't support the basic premise of this motion. Thank you.
So, Councillor Warboys, you're only allowed one go. Sorry.
It's just a point of information, I think.
I'm sorry?
It's a point of information. Voting is not a privilege. Voting is a right.
Thank you. Does any other councillor wish to make a comment in this debate? Okay, I'd like to say a few words. I can understand the concerns that are expressed by Councillor Mellon and others about voter ID, but actually in the natural walk of life, we are requested to present ID for many instances. For example, as Councillor Guthrie mentioned, to open a bank account. In fact, I've just been through the very same process myself. And even though it was an online bank account, I had to go through all the usual loops of address, photograph, and so on to get the account established, which is all well and good, and you could understand why they would want to have that from a security perspective and anti-money laundering and so forth. And there are other instances where you do not have to, by law, to produce ID, but ID is requested, and for very good reason. For example, when you go to register for a GP. And you could understand why a GP would want to be sure of who you are in terms of the treatment he's going to deliver on an ongoing basis. So I think I have a problem with Councillor Mellon's motion from those perspectives. And I'm also conscious of the fact that the right to vote is something that has been fought for over several centuries in this country and beyond, for which people have actually given their lives and gone to prison. And every right, in my view, has a responsibility attached to it. And I think that responsibility in this particular instance is that if you're going to go and vote, then you ought to be able to, it ought to be able to be proven that you are the person you say you are. And that's why, for example, other countries have introduced ID voting cards, or have a generic ID. I mean, I lived in the United States for a while, and I had to have an ID for various purposes, including the health service and so on. So I think when you look at it in the round, this idea of promoting an ID for voting seems quite sensible to me, and I think that we should not support this motion because it's not taking that responsibility as well as it should be, because we want to be able to guard our democracy, and voting is one of them, and we should make sure that it's done in the safest, most secure way possible. That's all I have to say on that. So, with that, Councillor Mellon, do you want to wish to add anything?
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Chairman, you'll be well aware that elections are won and lost by a very few votes occasionally. And sometimes not just one ward, but a whole district can be hung on the basis of a few notes. So it's really important that we do nothing to undermine the confidence that we have in our electoral system. And we actually know that the current public confidence is high. The Electoral Commission research shows it. Well over 80% of all the different measures that they measured. But this could take a serious knock if we implemented this measure and didn't do it well. And our hard-pressed staff at a polling station, looking at ID, does this really look like the person, the picture taken up to 10 years ago? Do we really want to put our staff through that and then undermine the confidence in the result, especially when things are so close in this area? If I can just sum up the arguments against this measure and in favour of the motion. Firstly, the bureaucratic burden of implementing mandatory voter ID will fall on this authority. Secondly, the effect of this measure may well be an impediment to those who don't currently hold an approved form of photo ID. It would put them off voting. And thirdly, the level of voter fraud is extraordinarily low. This is not a big problem. There are much bigger problems in the system, the fact that 9 million people are missing from the electoral roll. So can I encourage councillors to use your vote? I know you're going to have ID to vote in this occasion, but to vote against mandatory voter ID at the polling station and for this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now ask the Corporate Manager, Governance and Civic Office to conduct the electronic vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillors, if you wish to tab down, you will see the motion on notice received from Councillor Mellon. Please can you cast your votes? It's now showing in blue. That is 15 for and 15 against. So, Chair, I will ask you, do you want to exercise your casting vote?
I will, yes.
And
that will be against.
Okay, so that motion is lost then, Chair.
Thank you. Please note that the date of the next meeting will be Thursday, the 25th of November at 5:30 p.m. And I now close the meeting at 17:12.
Sorry, see if I can
be seated, please, for a moment.
Sorry, I'm going back. The vote was late coming through. And because Councillor Otten voted manually, the vote was actually 16 for and 14 against, so that was actually carried.
Sorry. Thank you all.